The idea of Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, and the annexation of Panama is a topic that blends historical context, geopolitical strategy, and speculative fiction. While there is no historical record of Trump attempting to annex Panama, the concept provides a rich ground for exploring the complexities of international relations, the legacy of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and the potential implications of such an action in the modern era. This article will delve into the historical background of U.S.-Panama relations, the role of the Panama Canal, the political climate during Trump's presidency, and the hypothetical scenario of a U.S. annexation of Panama under his administration. Historical context: U.S.-Panama relations. The Panama Canal, a strategic asset. The relationship between the United States and Panama has been heavily influenced by the Panama Canal, one of the most significant engineering feats of the 20th century. The canal, which connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, has been a critical strategic asset for global trade and military logistics since its completion in 1914. The U.S. played a pivotal role in the construction of the canal, which was initially controlled by the United States under the Hay-Buenavarilla Treaty of 1903. The treaty granted the U.S. control over the Canal Zone, a 10-mile-wide strip of land surrounding the canal, in perpetuity. This arrangement was a source of tension between the two nations for much of the 20th century, as Panamanians viewed the U.S. presence as a form of neocolonialism. The situation came to a head in the 1960s and 1970s, with widespread protests and calls for the canal's return to Panamanian control. The Torrijos-Carter Treaties in 1977, U.S. President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, which set the stage for the transfer of the canal to Panama by the end of the 20th century. The treaties were ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1978, and the canal was officially handed over to Panama on December 31, 1999. This marked a significant shift in U.S.-Panama relations, as the U.S. relinquished control of one of its most important strategic assets. Post-transfer relations. Since the transfer, U.S.-Panama relations have been generally positive, with the two nations cooperating on issues such as trade, security, and drug interdiction. The U.S. remains one of Panama's largest trading partners, and the canal continues to be a vital artery for global commerce. However, the legacy of U.S. involvement in Panama remains a sensitive topic, and the idea of the U.S. reasserting control over the canal or annexing Panama would likely be met with strong opposition both domestically and internationally. The Trump presidency, a new era of U.S. foreign policy. Trump's America First doctrine. Donald Trump's presidency, which began in January 2017, was marked by a shift in U.S. foreign policy towards a more nationalist and unilateral approach. Trump's America First doctrine emphasized the prioritization of U.S. interests over those of other nations, and he frequently criticized international agreements and institutions that he believed were not in the best interest of the United States. Trump's foreign policy was characterized by a willingness to challenge established norms and alliances, as seen in his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, and his criticism of NATO. His approach to Latin America was similarly assertive, with a focus on immigration, trade, and security. Trump's rhetoric often targeted countries in the region, particularly Mexico, which he accused of exploiting the U.S. through unfair trade practices and failing to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs. Trump and Latin America. A contentious relationship. Trump's relationship with Latin America was fraught with tension, particularly over issues such as immigration and trade. His administration implemented a zero-tolerance policy on illegal immigration, which led to the separation of thousands of migrant families at the U.S.-Mexico border. Trump also sought to renegotiate trade agreements with Latin American countries, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which he replaced with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. In addition to these policies, Trump's rhetoric often alienated Latin American leaders and populations. He referred to some Latin American countries as shithole countries and suggested that the U.S. should prioritize immigrants from countries like Norway over those from Latin America. This rhetoric, combined with his administration's policies, created a strained relationship between the U.S. and many Latin American nations. Trump's approach to Panama was relatively muted compared to his dealings with other Latin American countries. However, his administration did take steps to strengthen economic ties with Panama, particularly through trade. The U.S. and Panama have a long-standing trade relationship, with the U.S. being one of Panama's largest trading partners. The two countries signed a Trade Promotion Agreement, TPA, in 2007, which was implemented in 2012, and Trump's administration sought to build on this agreement to increase U.S. exports to Panama. Despite these efforts, Trump's broader foreign policy approach and rhetoric likely created some unease in Panama, particularly given the country's history with the U.S. and the sensitive nature of the Panama Canal. The idea of the U.S. reasserting control over the canal or annexing Panama would have been highly controversial and would have likely faced significant opposition both within Panama and internationally. The hypothetical annexation of Panama by the Trump administration. The rationale for annexation. In exploring the hypothetical scenario of a U.S. annexation of Panama under the Trump administration, it is important to consider the potential rationale for such an action. While there is no evidence to suggest that Trump or his administration ever seriously considered annexing Panama, the idea can be examined through the lens of Trump's foreign policy priorities and the strategic importance of the Panama Canal. One possible rationale for annexation could be the desire to reassert U.S. control over the Panama Canal, which remains a critical strategic asset for global trade and military logistics. Under Trump's America First doctrine, the U.S. might have sought to secure direct control over the canal to ensure that it could be used to serve U.S. interests, particularly in the context of growing competition with China and other global powers. Another potential rationale could be related to security concerns. The Trump administration placed a strong emphasis on border security and the prevention of illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Annexing Panama could theoretically provide the U.S. with greater control over its southern border and enhance its ability to combat these issues. However, such an action would likely be seen as a violation of Panama's sovereignty and would face significant legal and ethical challenges. Legal and ethical considerations. The annexation of Panama by the United States would raise significant legal and ethical questions. Under international law, the annexation of a sovereign state by another country is generally considered illegal unless it is done with the consent of the annexed state. The United Nations Charter, which the U.S. is a party to, prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In the case of Panama, there is no indication that the Panamanian government or people would consent to annexation by the United States. Panama has a long history of resisting foreign domination, and the idea of becoming a U.S. territory would likely be met with widespread opposition. Additionally, the international community would almost certainly condemn such an action, leading to diplomatic isolation and potential sanctions against the U.S. From an ethical perspective, the annexation of Panama would be seen as a violation of the principles of self-determination and sovereignty. The U.S. has historically championed these principles, and any attempt to annex Panama would be seen as hypocritical and contrary to the values that the U.S. claims to uphold. Potential consequences of annexation. The hypothetical annexation of Panama by the Trump administration would have far-reaching consequences, both for the U.S. and for the international community. Some of the potential consequences include diplomatic fallout. The annexation would likely lead to a significant deterioration in U.S. relations with Latin America and other regions. Countries around the world would view the U.S. as an aggressor, and the move could lead to the formation of new alliances against the U.S. economic impact. The annexation could disrupt global trade, particularly if the U.S. sought to impose new tariffs or restrictions on the use of the Panama Canal. This could lead to increased costs for businesses and consumers, and could potentially trigger a global economic downturn. Security concerns. The annexation could lead to increased instability in the region, as other countries might view the U.S. as a threat and take steps to counter its influence. This could lead to an arms race or even conflict in the region. Domestic opposition. Within the U.S., the annexation would likely be met with significant opposition from both the public and political leaders. Many Americans would view the move as a violation of the principles of democracy and self-determination, and it could lead to widespread protests and political unrest. Impact on U.S. global standing. The annexation would damage the U.S.'s reputation as a global leader and defender of international law. It could lead to a loss of influence in international organizations and a decline in the U.S.'s ability to shape global norms and policies. The role of the Panama Canal in the hypothetical scenario. The Panama Canal would be at the center of any hypothetical scenario involving the annexation of Panama by the Trump administration. The canal is not only a critical strategic asset, but also a symbol of Panama's sovereignty and independence. Any attempt by the U.S. to reassert control over the canal would be seen as a direct challenge to Panama's sovereignty, and would likely be met with fierce resistance. In the event of an annexation, the U.S. would face significant challenges in managing the canal. The canal's operation requires the cooperation of a wide range of stakeholders, including shipping companies, port authorities, and international organizations. The U.S. would need to navigate these complex relationships while also addressing the concerns of the Panamanian people, who would likely view the U.S. as an occupying force. Additionally, the annexation could lead to increased competition with other global powers, particularly China, which has been expanding its influence in Latin America. China has invested heavily in infrastructure projects in the region, including ports and railways, and has sought to strengthen its economic ties with Latin American countries. The U.S. annexation of Panama could be seen as a direct challenge to China's interests in the region, potentially leading to increased tensions between the two powers. The broader implications of U.S. annexation in the 21st century. The legacy of U.S. intervention in Latin America. The hypothetical annexation of Panama by the Trump administration must be understood within the broader context of U.S. intervention in Latin America. The U.S. has a long history of involvement in the region, often with the goal of protecting its economic and strategic interests. This history includes military interventions, covert operations, and support for authoritarian regimes, all of which have left a legacy of mistrust and resentment among many Latin Americans. The annexation of Panama would be seen as a continuation of this history, reinforcing the perception of the U.S. as an imperial power that disregards the sovereignty of smaller nations. This could have long-term consequences for U.S. relations with Latin America, making it more difficult for the U.S. to build partnerships and alliances in the region. The changing dynamics of global power. The 21st century has seen significant shifts in the global balance of power, with the rise of China and other emerging economies challenging the dominance of the United States. In this context, the annexation of Panama would be seen as an attempt by the U.S. to assert its dominance in a changing world. However, such an action could backfire, leading to increased resistance from other global powers and a further erosion of U.S. influence. The annexation could also accelerate the trend towards multipolarity, as other countries seek to counterbalance U.S. power by forming new alliances and partnerships. This could lead to a more fragmented and unstable international system, with increased competition and conflict between major powers. The role of international law and institutions. The annexation of Panama would raise important questions about the role of international law and institutions in the 21st century. The United Nations and other international organizations were established to prevent the kind of unilateral aggression that annexation represents. If the U.S. were to annex Panama, it would challenge the legitimacy of these institutions and could lead to a broader erosion of the international legal order. In response to such an action, other countries might seek to strengthen international institutions and develop new mechanisms to prevent future annexations. This could lead to a renewed emphasis on multilateralism and the rule of law, but it could also result in increased tensions between countries that support different visions of global governance. The impact on U.S. domestic politics. The annexation of Panama would have significant implications for U.S. domestic politics. The move would likely be deeply polarizing, with strong opposition from both the left and the right. Progressives would view the annexation as a violation of democratic principles and an example of U.S. imperialism, while conservatives might see it as a necessary step to protect U.S. interests and security. The annexation could also lead to a broader debate about the role of the U.S. in the world and the extent to which the country should pursue its interests at the expense of other nations. This debate could shape U.S. foreign policy for years to come, influencing everything from trade and immigration to military intervention and international cooperation. Conclusion. The hypothetical scenario of Donald Trump annexing Panama is a complex and multifaceted topic that touches on issues of history, geopolitics, and international law. While there is no evidence to suggest that such an action was ever seriously considered by the Trump administration, the idea provides a useful framework for exploring the challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. in the 21st century. The annexation of Panama would have far-reaching consequences, both for the U.S. and for the international community. It would challenge the principles of sovereignty and self-determination, disrupt global trade and security, and potentially accelerate the shift towards a more multipolar world. At the same time, it would raise important questions about the role of international law and institutions, and the extent to which the U.S. should pursue its interests in a changing global landscape. Ultimately, the idea of the U.S. annexing Panama serves as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of international relations in the modern era. It highlights the need for careful consideration of the consequences of foreign policy decisions, and the importance of upholding the principles of democracy, sovereignty, and the rule of law in an increasingly interconnected world.